In 1968, 11-year-old Mary Flora Bell would murder two young boys by strangling them to death in Newcastle, United Kingdom. Now, the real question here is, was she born bad or was she made that way? Hi everybody, and welcome back to Killer Concepts, the place where we talk about all things true crime. My name's Peyton. If you have not done so already, or if you are new here, make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below and turn on your post notifications so that you do not miss a thing. So today we're talking about an 11-year-old girl named Mary Bell who in 1968 murdered two young children of ages 3 and 4 years old. Some people may think that she was just born bad, and others may think that she was turned into a monster by how she was raised. I'd like to talk a little bit about that and more today, so I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about her early life, into her crimes, and then we'll end with what you think about Mary Bell. On May 26, 1957, young Mary Flora Bell would be born in Newcastle upon Tyne, Northumberland, England. She was born to a woman named Betty McCricket, who was only 17 years old at the time, and she had actually spent her life as a sex worker. Her family said that many times Betty was not around as she would go off to work in Glasgow, England. Mary Bell had a very rough childhood. To say it plainly, her mother was not kind to her. She did not treat her well, and she very much abused her daughter. It is not known for sure who Mary Bell's father was, but many believe it was a man by the name of Billy Bell, who would eventually be arrested for burglary, and he had been an on and off criminal for many, many years. He would end up marrying Betty McCricket, Mary's mother, when Mary was only a few months old, but nobody knows for sure if that was her father or not. As I said, Betty was extremely cruel to young Mary. There are multiple family member accounts that point to that and that back up Mary's statements over the years, including the fact that many believed that Betty had actually tried to kill young Mary multiple times in her early years of her life. One of these instances would be that Mary had apparently fallen out of a window. Many of the family members believed that she had been pushed or that it was done on purpose to try and kill Mary, and that Betty was just trying to make it look like an accident. On another occasion, young Mary Bell had also consumed a large amount of sleeping pills. Again, Betty said that this was an accident, but there have been accounts from witnesses who have said that they saw Betty feeding young Mary sleeping pills as if they were just candy, which clearly is not something that you do to your child, and you definitely don't do it accidentally. So if she is feeding them to her kid, then most likely she did not almost overdose on them accidentally. So easy enough to say she was not very good at protecting her daughter. Instead, she would very much focus on hurting her. It would also come out eventually when Mary would accuse her mother that she had allowed men to sexually abuse her since she was the age of 4 years old. Like I said, her mother was a sex worker, but apparently she would invite Johns into the house to perform those sexual acts. Many people believe that the reason she may have been feeding Mary sleeping pills was so that she would be unconscious and she could sell her daughter to men. Now, I have not found a ton of evidence on that, but I have seen it mentioned in multiple articles, so let's take it with a grain of salt. But it is definitely believed that she was sexually abused as a child as well. One thing I want to make sure to mention is that I had said that Mary had fallen out of a window when she was very young, and her mother had said it was accidental. Well, during that fall, Mary was extremely injured. She actually suffered brain damage. This brain damage happened to her frontal cortex. This is something that we see very often in killers or people who have a hard time controlling their actions. And this is because this is the area that is involved in your voluntary movements and your decision making. So, somebody who has a damaged prefrontal cortex very well may have a hard time distinguishing between what is right and what is wrong. And this is something that I want you to keep in mind as you hear Mary's case and the things that she has done. Now that we have gotten a little bit more into what happened to Mary as a child, we're going to talk about the murders that Mary committed and the things leading up to those murders. One thing I can say though is that killer children absolutely terrify me. I don't know if it's because it's the perfect mix of a cute young child who should be trustworthy and should be innocent, being able to just turn their back on someone and commit an absolute heinous crime and not really comprehend what they did, or the fact that we're surrounded by children all the time and we would never think of them doing stuff like this. It's a very rare thing, but when you hear about some of the things that Mary Bell did, it's very, very eerie. So, for weeks before Mary actually committed her first murder, she had been acting strange, according to people who knew her. On May 11th, 1968, Mary had actually been playing with a 3-year-old boy. She played with many kids in her neighborhood, and the 3-year-old boy would end up getting seriously injured. The little boy had fallen from the top of an air raid shelter, and his parents had just brushed it off. They thought it was an accident, no big deal. It had nothing to do with Mary being there because she was only 10 or 11 at the time. It couldn't have been her. But things started getting stranger when the next day, 3 mothers would go to the police and they would tell them that young Mary Bell had tried to strangle their 3 daughters. This is scary behavior for a young child to have. You don't want to have a child out there that's being that rough with other children. And a lot of these kids in this neighborhood, it seemed like back then and in this part of the United Kingdom, they kind of were just free to roam and do as they pleased. And then when things would happen, it'd be brought up. Well, the police would interview Mary about what had happened, and they'd explain that it's not okay. And then they kind of just brushed it off like the little boy's parents did. They thought this is a really young girl. You know, she's just roughhousing or she is misunderstood. No little girl would do something like that. So they interviewed her and then they brushed it off, which would end up being a huge mistake. Then on May 25th, 1968, only a day before Mary Bell would turn 11 years old, she would strangle a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown in Scotswood, England. It had happened at an abandoned house, and Mary actually had a friend named Norma Bell who was with her at the time and had witnessed the incident. But Norma would not say anything. And I know you're wondering, Norma Bell and Mary Bell were not related. They just were really close friends who happened to have very similar names. And Norma was also older than Mary, but Mary had a much higher IQ than Norma did. And so really they were mentally around the same age. Mary Bell would leave the scene and then she'd come back with Norma Bell and they'd find 2 other boys there who had been playing, and these boys had found the body. So they would call police and police would be absolutely astonished. What could have happened to this young boy? He was only 4 years old. He was out playing. What could have happened to him? So there was a tiny bit of blood and saliva on the boy's face, and that's the only thing that pointed to any kind of violence in his circumstance. The only other weird thing is that there was a small bottle of painkillers laying nearby him. The police would look at the painkillers and they would put the dead boy and the painkillers together, and they would just go ahead and assume that young 4-year-old Martin Brown must have swallowed some of the painkillers and that the death was just an accident. Nothing had happened. But strange things would continue to happen following Brown's death. Martin Brown's family originally agreed with the police. They didn't question it. Yeah, he must have got a hold of some pills and swallowed them and overdosed. But they may have started to suspect a little bit more when 11-year-old Mary Bell would end up showing up on their doorstep outside of their house. Mary Bell would knock on their door and she would ask the deceased boy's mother if she could see Martin Brown. The mother would say that her child was dead, and Mary Bell would basically say, I know, I want to see him in his coffin. This absolutely sends shivers down my spine. This is a 4-year-old boy that was murdered by the little girl who is standing on the parents' doorstep, and she says something like wanting to see him in his coffin dead. That is chilling. Obviously, the mother is extremely upset by hearing this, and she will get Mary to leave, or when Mary doesn't leave, she ends up slamming the door in Mary's face. The parents may have ended up going to the police, but once again, nothing was done. It was written off like it was no big deal. Mary Bell is just being a young girl, even if she's acting strange. Not long after the murder of Martin Brown and Mary appearing on his parents' doorstep, Mary Bell and Norma Bell, her friend, would end up breaking into a nursery school in the area. Once again, this is an extremely disturbing trip. They would vandalize the nursery school when they broke into it, and they would leave notes, really chilling notes. One of them saying that they had killed Martin Brown, other ones saying that they would come back. The notes were absolutely horrifying. To be very specific, I am going to read you a couple of the notes that the girls left. I want to give you a very good warning that they are very disturbing and some of them are very vulgar, so if you have children in the room, you may want to turn down the volume or put in some headphones. One of them said, "We did murder Martin Brown. Fuck off, you bastard." Another one I can't fully read, but I can read a part of it, and it says, "You are, because we murdered Martin Brown, you better look out. There are murderers about." And then another one said, "I murder so that I may come back." They're terrible. And the fact that such young girls had written these letters is even more scary. It's so scary that a young girl would write these kinds of things, let alone do them. And if you really pay attention, you'll see there are many words that are misspelled or spelled incorrectly. And she was quite blatantly, along with her friend Nora, trying to scare people. And this is the point where at the moment I can't see a victim because it is so vulgar. So when the nursery school would open back up, they'd find all these disturbing notes and things left by Mary and Nora. The police thought it was a horrible prank and there was no big deal about it. The nursery school was smart enough to install an alarm, and it would just so happen that Mary Bell and Nora Bell would come back to have more fun at the nursery school. The alarm would sound and go off. The police would end up catching Mary and Norma at the school, but they were just kind of outside loitering, even though you'd think they'd be connecting the dots that this little girl is hanging out at the nursery school that has been vandalized. And she has also shown up on the mother's doorstep of a murder victim. And she has tried to strangle 3 children before, but the police still don't put it together. They end up letting Norma and Mary off the hook because, once again, they're young children. How could they ever do such horrible things? And once again, this would be a terrible, terrible mistake. When Mary was let off the hook for the nursery and everything else, she would go to school and tell her friends how she had killed Martin Brown. None of her classmates thought she was being serious. Once again, they were 11 years old, and Belle had always been a show off to her classmates, and so everybody thought she was just making it up, trying to get attention. But it would turn out she wasn't, and she would end up murdering a second child. So on July 31st, 2 months after the first murder, Mary Belle would take her friend Norma Belle with her, and she would murder another kid. This was 3-year-old Brian Howe, and she would kill him by strangling him. Apparently what she did is she'd pretend to be massaging his neck, and then she'd just keep squeezing. And she didn't stop there this time. She actually had a pair of scissors, and she would mutilate his body. She would carve things into him as well as mutilate his penis, which is absolutely atrocious. When Brian Howe's sister would go looking for the 3-year-old boy, Mary and Norma had actually offered to help her find him. You know, he had been missing, he's really young, and Mary would tell her to go look over by a pile of concrete blocks. Norma would say, no, don't go look over there, there's nothing there, knowing that his body was over there, but trying to cover it up because Mary wanted to be in the middle of it, and his sister would go the other way. But not long after, other searchers would come along, and that is where they discover the body of 3-year-old Brian Howe, who had been strangled and mutilated to death. When his body was finally found, that was it. The neighborhood was paying attention now. The police were paying attention now, because this is the second very young child who had been murdered in the area in a matter of months. The police would start interviewing local children to see if they had known what happened, and many of them would say no. But when the police would finally get Brian's information back from the coroner, they would find something even more disturbing. So after his blood had cooled, apparently a new mark showed up on Brian Howe's body, and that was an M that had been carved into his chest. Someone had used a blade to carve an M into his chest, and we know that clearly that stands for Mary Belle, but the police didn't know that. And then the autopsy also had shown that the strangulation that had been done to Brian Howe had used much less force than an adult would typically use. And so police would start to come to terms with the fact that they may have to look at a child as the killer this time. Little did Mary Belle know, but when she decided to carve into young Brian's body with broken scissors, this is where she'd make a mistake, because she'd leave the scissors behind at the crime scene, and the police would have them. And the police would be the only ones who knew about these scissors. And Mary Belle had always been, since she had started her crimes, she wanted to be in the middle of situation. Like I said, she was only 11 years old, but she had apparently gone to all the press conferences, searches for the young boys. She would be there, and she would eventually talk to police. And she would say that she had seen a child, somebody who's playing with Brian Howe, playing with a pair of broken scissors. And these scissors had been found by his body. And this is what would point the police directly to her, because nobody else knew about these scissors but the police officers themselves. And now they know that Mary Belle knew, which was very unusual because she was not the one who had found his body, and she was not the police. When police would start questioning Norma and Mary Belle, Mary would originally not say anything. She was very smart, and she had actually said no comment to the police officers, which is not something that usually comes out of an 11-year-old's mouth. But Norma Bell, she broke immediately. The floodgates opened and she started telling the police everything about what had happened. She had been along with Mary when she killed the two children, and Mary had mutilated the body of Brian Howe, and she made a deal with the police that she would basically be off the hook as long as she testified against Mary Bell, and that's exactly what she would do. So both girls would go to trial for the crime of murder, even though Norma Bell was working with the prosecution at the time. Mary Bell would get up on the stand and she would be considered born evil by the prosecution. They would say that she had committed the murders that she did out of pleasure and basically just wanting to hurt somebody. But her defense would come back and they would say that she had clear signs of psychopathy, and I believe all of us can see that. And basically, she could not be held 100% accountable for her actions and how she had murdered those two kids. Let's also not forget to mention that there were many precursors to her doing that the police avoided, but I'm sure that was not included in the trial. And so the jury would come back and say that Mary definitely was guilty of murdering those two children. However, they were going to give her manslaughter because she was not 100% competent to be held for murder. And then she was sentenced to one of the strongest sentences that a young girl could possibly get at the time, and that was at the Queen's pleasure. Now, I am not from the United Kingdom, so I had to look this up, and this basically means whenever the Crown feels you are fit to be released. So it can be indefinitely. Norma Bell would then be cleared of everything she had done. She would not get murder or anything else because she did have a mental disability. She was a little bit slower than Mary, and she was older but didn't quite understand things the way that Mary did. And so they believed that Norma Bell really was just a follower and she kind of just went along with what Mary did, and Mary was the mastermind. So 12 years after Mary Bell had been sent to prison and a rehabilitation center where she actually spent time with all boys because she was the only girl, she would end up being released in 1980. When Mary Bell was released in 1980, she would be given a new identity so she could try and live a normal life. She was only 23 years old at the time. When she turned 27, she would give birth to her daughter that she had on May 25th, 1984. One thing I'd like to mention about this, which I didn't realize at first, but I just realized it now, is that her daughter was born on the day that Brian Howe was murdered by Mary Bell. I couldn't imagine being born on the day that my mother killed somebody. That is absolutely sad. Her daughter actually knew nothing about the crimes of her mother until she was 14 years old, and the tabloids had actually found Mary by finding her husband at the time. And the family would have to move several times because the tabloids would never have enough of her. And Brian Howe and Martin Brown's parents would never be happy with the fact that Mary was let out after only 12 years in prison, and that they would give her not only such a light sentence, but then she would have the freedom of having a whole new identity and not having to live with the consequences of what she did. Before we're done here today, though, I would like to talk a little bit about Mary Bell's childhood again. So this is where the question of nature versus nurture really comes in. So the prosecution says that Mary Bell was born evil, but was she really? She did have damage to her prefrontal cortex, which very much has an impact on your decision making. And this was caused by the fact that her mother very well probably pushed her out of a window when she was young, trying to kill her. And Mary, when she was actually in prison, would end up writing letters to her mother basically saying that it was her fault that she had become what she had become. So I want to hear your opinion. After everything that Mary Bell had experienced all before the age of 11, sexual abuse, being fed sleeping pills, dealing with Johns coming in and out of the house since her mother was a sex worker, and how her mother had tried to kill her several times. Do you think that played a part in who she became and why she was such a angry little girl and why she would want to hurt other children? Or do you think she was just born that way? This case absolutely fascinates me. Nobody quite knows where Mary Bell is today. Like I said, she is anonymous. She has a new life. She does not need to share with anybody who she really is. And I'd just be curious to hear from her at this point in her life now that she's in her 60s. I'm assuming she has not committed any more crimes, or I'm sure she would have gone back to prison. But yeah, this case is just very fascinating, and it's a doozy, and it's terrifying that a child could commit these kind of crimes. Before we go, I just want to say thank you for watching and coming to my channel. If you are new here, make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below and turn on the post notifications by hitting that bell so that you do not miss any videos I post. I try and post weekly. As of lately, like I said on my last video, I have been about a day or two late on posting my videos. I've been having trouble with my computer on getting it to upload properly, and so my videos have been like 2 days late, but I'm also not the best at time management. But at least I'm being honest with you guys. If you have any case suggestions or anything that you'd like to say to me, make sure to comment down below as long as it's kind, or send me an email at killerconceptsvlog@gmail.com, and don't forget to follow me on Instagram. So I have a personal Instagram as well as my true crime Instagram. And on my true crime Instagram, you can make sure to keep up with any updates I have. If I'm not posting a video, I'll tell you on there, and just make sure to check it out. It's Killer Concepts Vlog on Instagram and super easy to find. Before you go, make sure to remember that the world's most dangerous minds hide in the most unlikely places. Stay safe.